In a small railway car outside of Compiègne, France, German and Allied representatives met to sign an armistice that would end the Great War on November 11, 1918. After 4 years of fighting, the war that was said to end all wars was over. Germany was forced to surrender as its economy crumbled, leaving it with little supplies and starving citizens. Soldiers rejoiced as Allied and German troops alike returned home. However, while the war might have been over, the path to peace would be a long and difficult journey as world leaders came together to rebuild Europe and ensure peace across continents. Following the Great War, world leaders were tasked with the responsibility of restoring peace in Europe by making compromises that would ensure the prevention of future conflicts. Yet, their efforts put forth in the Treaty of Versailles sparked controversy among Europeans, thus failing to accomplish their goal of creating the treaty to end all wars. Following the armistice in November of 1918, world leaders and delegates from over 32 countries gathered in Paris on January 18, 1919 to discuss the peace terms at the Paris Peace Conference. The leaders, or the Big Four, were leaders from France, Great Britain, Italy, and the United States. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and Hungary, were not invited to the conference. Russian delegates were also not in attendance after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. The Big Four, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando were the heads of the peace conference. Over the course of 6 months, the four heads of state met in over 145 private sessions to discuss the peace terms in Paris. While all four men played essential roles in the peace discussions, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Wilson drafted the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, which became the most famous treaty ratified during the conference. Whilst the leaders drafted the treaties in private, weekly plenary conferences were held with other countries to discuss various aspects of the peace terms regarding the Allied nations. However, as each country expressed its individual aspirations and goals for the conference, compromise was necessary as the Allied powers experienced conflicts of interest among the delegates. As the most influential leaders of the Paris Peace Conference, the Big Three, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Wilson, held varying opinions on the drafting of the Treaty of Versailles and the Allied powers' peace terms with Germany. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau expressed his country's fear and anger towards the Germans and their shared border throughout the conference. He believed that Germany deserved harsh punishment for its invasion of French territory, thus demanding reparation and assurance that future attacks on France would not occur. Clemenceau argued that Wilson and Lloyd George didn't understand his position since America is far away, protected by the ocean, and not even Napoleon himself could touch England. He sought to declare the Rhineland, a small region that lay on the French and German border, an independent state that would serve as a buffer zone between the two countries. Clemenceau also believed that downsizing the German army would prevent future invasions, yet required a promise of aid from the Allies should Germany breach the borders again. Clemenceau's influence in the conference initiated the inclusion of many of France's goals in the final drafting of the treaty. David Lloyd George, who served as a mediator between Clemenceau and Wilson, represented Britain's unique agenda as a foreign aid in the Great War. Lloyd George sought not to cripple the Germans like Clemenceau since he worried that it might cause the people to turn to communism as it did in Russia. However, Britain expressed a desire to weaken the military to prevent future invasions and attacks on its naval fleets. Overall, David Lloyd George saw Germany as a potential trade partner and did not believe that the German people deserved harsh punishment since it could send the already broken country into economic turmoil. Lloyd George represented the British agenda through his desire to preserve democracy and fair commerce in Europe. Woodrow Wilson became a strong advocate for democracy as he introduced his plan for world peace in Paris. In 1918, Wilson and a group of advisors drafted the 14 Points, which he hoped would lay the foundation for the peace treaty and prevent future wars if it was ratified. Germany also had faith in his plan after signing the armistice, hoping that the peace agreements would be based on Wilson's points. The 14 Points highlighted the importance of free trade, open agreements and negotiations, and the installation of democracy across continents. However, the quintessential aspect of Wilson's points was the creation of the League of Nations, a committee comprised of international delegates that would discuss foreign policy and peacefully resolve international conflicts. While the public in Europe praised and admired Wilson, his fellow delegates felt that the 14 Points were unrealistic and impractical for this treaty. Wilson fought valiantly for his plan, but in the end the president was forced to concede many of his points in favor of compromise. Despite their varying agendas, the compromises between the leaders in Paris laid the foundation of the Treaty of Versailles, which defined the territorial, militaristic, and financial limitations that would be set on Germany. Under the territorial agreements, Germany would lose over 25,000 miles of land and almost 10% of its population. Primarily, all land gained in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would return to Russia. German-occupied lands such as Poland, Belgium, Denmark, and other regions surrounding Austria and Czechoslovakia would also gain independence from Germany, thus separating the Central Power from East Prussia and its allies. But most importantly, the mining regions of Alsace-Lorraine and the Saarland would be returned to France. Finally, all foreign colonies possessed by Germany in China, the Pacific, and Africa would be divided among the Allied nations. In order to prevent future invasion of Allied nations, the Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany's army would be decreased to 100,000 men. The German government would also be prohibited from having an air and naval force, with the exception of 6 ships used for commerce. In accordance with the depletion of the military, the manufacturing of large amounts of weaponry would also be banned. Lastly, Germany would be forced to demilitarize the Rhineland for the next 15 years unless given explicit permission from the Allied nations. The treaty addressed the financial aspect of the Allies' agreements by placing the war guilt on Germany, thus forcing it to pay for all reparations of the past 4 years. Article 231, or the War Guilt Clause, claimed that Germany was guilty for the war, therefore making it responsible for the destruction across Europe. Hence, Germany would be required to pay up to $33 billion to the Allied nations as reparation for the losses. Despite the protests of economists who advised against this forced payment, the Allied leaders were adamant in their decision that Germany needed to pay for the war. Finally, under President Wilson's influence, a League of Nations consisting of Allied powers would be organized to discuss international agenda and foreign conflicts. The Central Powers were prohibited from joining the League. Upon receiving the terms of the treaty, German delegates and government leaders were shocked by the brutality of the Allied powers. While they had depended on Wilson to lead the negotiations and development of the treaty, German officials felt that the agreement violated the spirit of the 14 points. This agreement was more of a diktat than a treaty to the Germans when they were given the ultimatum to sign or face invasion. After the elected leader of the new Weimar Republic, Philipp Scheidemann, resigned from office, Gustav Bauer stepped into the position and sent a list of protests to the Allied delegates. In this list, Bauer explained that Germany would not be able to afford the reparations in its current economic condition. Moreover, while they would be willing to grant Poland and Belgium independence, Germany offered a list of counter-proposals to the leaders in Paris in response to the harsher demands. First, Germany would willingly demilitarize the Rhineland if they would be permitted into the League of Nations. Germany would also be willing to aid in the reconstruction of France and provide resources in exchange for continued possession of the Saarland. However, most importantly, Germany pled that the War Guilt Clause be nullified and the payment for reparations diminished in order to preserve its economy. Germans offered to aid in the repairing of France, yet they could not withstand the guilt of war and the cost of reparations with their crumbling infrastructure. After sending their response, the Weimar officials received a notice from the Allies that they were to sign the treaty as it is or face invasion in 24 hours. Despite their protests, the German delegates were forced to concede. On June 28, 1918, the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Allied and German delegates met in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles for the signing of the treaty. Harry Hansen, an American reporter, described the hall as a long and narrow room, more like a corridor than a salon. The delegates ascended the marble staircase and passed through the Salle de la Paix, the Hall of Peace, whence they entered the Hall of Mirrors. President Wilson entered almost immediately after Clemenceau and was saluted with discreet applause. The German delegation entered by way of the Hall of Peace and slipped almost unnoticed into its seats at the end of the hall. After the initial greetings and all the delegates had signed the treaty, Clemenceau said, "Messieurs, all the signatures have been given. The signature of the conditions of peace between the Allied and associated powers and the German Republic is an accomplished fact. This session is adjourned." Immediately afterward, the great guns began to boom from the battery near the Orangerie. The delegates rose and congratulated one another. Notables streamed out of the palace to join the crowd, which had begun shouting in wild enthusiasm with the first sound of the guns. The Germans were the first to leave the Hall of Mirrors, passing out alone and immediately taking their automobiles for the hotel. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany in ruins. The German people felt betrayed by those who established the Weimar Republic and conceded to the treaty that sent the economy into a debilitating depression. With the government collapsing and German resources completely exhausted, the dying democratic society left a power vacuum, which allowed radical movements to rise in Germany as the people grew more skeptical of their leaders. Among them was a young corporal who, filled with hatred toward the Allies and Weimar Republic after hearing of the signing of the treaty from his hospital bed, was inspired to join one of these radical movements. He rose up to become the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and was determined to usher in a new Reich in Germany and restore his homeland to its former glory.